In my last podcast, I covered the invasions by Waikato in the 1830s that left Taranaki mostly deserted. The land was fertile with a good climate and ideal for farming, but it would lie empty for another 8 years. When the New Zealand Company arrived in 1839, it entered negotiations to purchase Taranaki from the branch of Te Ātiawa who had relocated to the Marlborough Sounds. Te Ātiawa were keen to sell because they wanted to move back to Taranaki, and they understood that a Pākehā presence would help protect them from the Waikato tribes who had driven them out 8 years earlier. In his book, The History of Taranaki, Benjamin Wells described how the New Zealand Company signed the land purchase deed with 30 Te Ātiawa chiefs on the 8th of December 1839. The purchase included all the land from the Mokau River through Taranaki and down to Wellington and Cape Tekukahori on the east coast. 10% of the land was to be allocated to Māori. These negotiations were facilitated and witnessed by Richard Barrett, who was living among the Te Ātiawa tribe with his Māori wife. This agreement was then confirmed on February 1840 by 72 chiefs who travelled to Ngā Motu, now New Plymouth, where they viewed the land. This was again witnessed by Richard Barrett. The surveying party also met up with the remnants of the Te Ātiawa who were still living there. During this visit, Barrett took them to Waitara, where it was agreed that the fertile soils along the banks of the Waitara might become the garden of the Pacific. Significantly, Te Ātiawa only owned a small portion of the land they sold. They had no rights to sell land belonging to other iwi, and the New Zealand Company made no effort to negotiate with the other owners. However, both the Ngā Motu and Waitara were locations that Te Ātiawa had previously occupied. It should also be noticed that this purchase was one of many overlapping agreements made by the New Zealand Company and other land speculators that covered most of the North and South Islands. Most of these purchases were disallowed following the treaty, including most of the Taranaki purchase. However, with the Taranaki purchase agreed to, the first settlers sailed from Plymouth in England, and on the 30th of March 1841 they arrived in Ngā Motu, which had now been christened New Plymouth. Many of the Te Ātiawa Māori who were living in Waikanae then returned to their homeland, along with Richard Barrett, who began cattle farming in Taranaki. The New Zealand Company then set to work surveying their new settlement, allocating land for both the English settlers and the returning Māori. However, the Waikato tribes regarded Te Ātiawa as a subservient tribe who had no right to sell land, which Waikato claimed as being theirs by right of conquest. Te Whewhewhero regarded the sale made by Te Ātiawa as being illegal and demanded an equal payment, which he subsequently received in January 1842. In the agreement it stated, quote, "Know all men by this paper that we chiefs of Waikato do let go and sell these lands of ours to George Clark, the protector of natives, for Her Majesty the Queen of England, her heirs and successors, whether male or female, the land and all the things that are on it or under this land we sell to George Clark, the protector of natives, for the estate of the Queen." It was signed by Te Whewhewhero and his brother Te Kati, and included the entire coastal area of present-day Taranaki. It should be noted that Māori custom demanded that ownership of conquered land could only be claimed if it remained continuously occupied, and this was not the case in Taranaki, as the Waikato tribes had returned to their own lands following the invasion. Likewise, apart from the 50 or so survivors, Te Ātiawa and the other Taranaki tribes had also vacated the land. However, with the land issues apparently resolved, the road to Waitara was begun, including surveying sections for a future settlement in that location. However, when the settlers also began building an inland road to Waimate, the Wesleyan minister stationed there vigorously opposed the road, stirring up the local Māori by claiming that the road was being made so that the settlers could seize their lands. And this was just the beginning of the difficulties with local Māori. It became much worse when the slaves taken by the Waikato tribes were released to return to Taranaki. While there was an abundance of suitable land available, it was not the land that they wanted. Encouraged by the missionaries, the returning slaves argued that they had not sold their land and they had received nothing for it. Those Māori who had already sold the land advised the agent for the New Zealand company, John Wicksteed, not to pay out anything more. Consequently, those who felt disadvantaged began to resort to violence, with some property being burned and threats being made. And the returning slaves were now the majority. In December 1843, Captain Robert Fitzroy arrived in Auckland to take over the role of governor, following the death of Governor Hobson. This would ultimately have devastating consequences for the Taranaki settlement, for both Māori and European. In April 1844, Commissioner William Spain began his process of settling the native claims in Manawatu, Whanganui and Taranaki. After several days of examining witnesses, his judgment for Taranaki was to award 60,000 acres for the settlement, following their payment by the New Zealand company of £200 to the governor to be applied for the benefit of the resident natives. This was the third payment made for the land, following the first payment being made to Te Ātiawa and the second payment to Te Wherewhero. While this decision was welcomed by the settlers, the local Māori immediately protested to the governor. 2 months later, Wiremu Kingi made the following statement in a speech to Governor Fitzroy. As translated, this states, and I quote, "Friend Governor, listen to us respecting this land, respecting Waitara. Our hearts are dark by reason of Mr. Spain's words. Indeed, the Europeans are wrong in striving for this land, which was never sold by its owners, the men of Ngāti Awa. Now, when the Ngāti Awa tribe went to Kapiti, they left some men behind on our lands, who were surprised by the Waikatos, and some of them led away captive, who, having arrived in Waikato, were afterwards returned by the Waikatos to Waitara to dwell there. Others came back from Kapiti. We love the land of our ancestor. This also is the determination of our people. Waitara shall not be given up. The men to whom it belongs will hold it for themselves. There was not a single man of the Ngāti Awa tribe who received payment from Colonel Wakefield. These are the only men who took payment, the men of Ngamotu and Puketapu, and they have no right in Waitara." Te Rangataki had become the preeminent Te Ātiawa chief after his father died. He was also known by his baptismal name of Wiremu Kingi, and he was a key player on the first land sale to the New Zealand company, being the first to sign the deed of sale. He had persuaded Te Ātiawa to sell their lands in Taranaki so they could all return to occupy the land and enjoy the resulting security and benefits from the European settlement. However, he had also promised his dying father never to sell their tribal land in Taranaki. Kingi's claim that no Te Ātiawa had received payment for the land when he was the first to sign the agreement seems disingenuous. However, Kingi's claim was supported by Octavius Hadfield, a Church of England missionary who was living with Māori on the Kapiti coast, and who was a personal friend. Following a detailed analysis of Kingi's rights to the land in Waitara, Hadfield states in his article, "The Second Year of One of England's Little Wars," and I quote, "It appears, therefore, that nothing whatever occurred during the interval between Wee King's departure from Waitara in 1827 and his return to that place in 1848 to affect his rights in Waitara, or those of that portion of the tribe who acknowledged him as their head and accompanied him in their movements." Was Kingi right in his claim to Waitara? I can only present what was recorded. But there was also another claim to Taranaki. On October 1844, Governor Fitzroy received the following statement from the Ngāti Maniapoto chiefs in Kawhia, those who had released the Te Ātiawa slaves. I quote, "You are going to Taranaki. Listen to our parting words. That land is ours. We claim it by right of conquest, and some part of it by possession. We have power to enforce our claim if we choose, but our inclination is for peace, not war. The governor, who is dead, professed to buy the interests of the Waikatos in the lands of Taranaki and paid Te Whero for them. Te Whero had a perfect right to sell his own or his tribe's interest, but not ours. He was not the principal man in subjugating Taranaki. Many were before him. We do not recognise his sale. We might insist on our right to a payment equal to that of Te Whero, but we're not so very anxious about that, as we want Europeans. We sent the present occupants of Taranaki home to the land of their fathers, and we did so from the influence of Christian principles. But we did not send them back to assume the airs of superiority that they have done, or to molest the Europeans. Go and tell the Ngāti that the Waikato chiefs remind them that the land is theirs, and advise them to settle their disputes with the Europeans, or the Waikatos will settle it for them." End of quote. However, in November 1844, Governor Fitzroy decided to set aside Spain's recommendation, and he reduced the land for the settlement to just 3,500 acres. He also required that the New Zealand company pay a further £350 to be used as payment for the returning slaves who had not sold their land. This was then the fourth payment made for the land. The settlers could only purchase land outside those boundaries if their Maori owners were willing to sell. Local Maori were jubilant at this decision. For the settlers, it was devastating. Most of the settler farms were outside of the new boundaries of what became known as the Fitzroy block. They had developed these properties, built homes, and planted crops, only to be forced to abandon them. Fitzroy's decision appears to have been strongly influenced by the missionaries, who were advising Maori not to sell their land. He viewed the New Zealand company as just an opportunistic land jobber, the threat of which was one of the reasons for establishing the treaty at Waitangi. But then Governor Fitzroy was replaced by George Grey in November 1845, much to the relief of the Taranaki settlers. In July 1846, Prime Minister Gladstone sent a dispatch from Downing Street, London, expressing surprise at Fitzroy's decision to overrule Commissioner Spain's judgment that had allocated 60,000 acres for the settlement. And he encouraged the new governor to reverse that decision. Consequently, in January 1847, George Grey and Colonel Wakefield arrived in New Plymouth to discuss the adoption of some conciliatory measures for the obtaining of more land for the settlement. He brought Wiremu Kingi with him and proposed creating a settlement for Kingi and his people on the north bank of the Waitara River. But Kingi objected, telling the governor, and I quote, that he did not need his assistance, that he would erect his pa himself and build it wherever he pleased and when he pleased, without asking permission of anyone. Gray's angry response was, "Tell him that I say he is to remain at Waikanae, and I will now place him under guard, and that if he dares to remove to Waitara without my permission, I will send the war steamer after him and destroy all his canoes." In March 1847, Gray instructed Donald Maclean, his new commissioner, to attempt to address the problem of recovering the land allocated by Commissioner Spain, land that had been reoccupied by Māori following Fitzroy's decision. The Tataraimaka block, Omata and the Grey blocks were subsequently purchased. However, the settlers also wanted to repurchase the lands at Waitara. While he was based in Waikanae, Kingi actively supported the government while they were putting down the rebellion by Te Rauparaha's nephew, Te Rangahaiata. However, Kingi had set his mind to return to his homeland, Taranaki. In April 1848, Kingi sold his land in Waikanae to the British and brought his Te Ātiawa people back to Taranaki. The government only allowed him to do this after Kingi promised to settle on the north bank of the Waitara River, as originally planned, leaving the south bank of the river available for the settlers. However, on arriving in Waitara, Kingi claimed that he was afraid to settle on the north bank because some Ngāti Maniapoto had cultivations there. Furthermore, he was given permission from an old chief, Atati Ruru, to settle on the south bank. He then erected a very large and strong pa and began cultivating the land. Having taken possession of the land south of the Waitara River, Kingi and his tribe worked hard at cultivating the land. Within a few years, they had set up a number of settlements near the river, generating large crops of wheat, maize and potatoes, which they used to purchase horses and cattle, ploughs and other agricultural implements. In 1856, they sold over 8,000 pounds of produce and used the profit to purchase more goods in New Plymouth. The stage was now set. The settlers were beginning to recover. Some Māori were also prospering. The discord over Waitara looked like it might settle down, and even the Waikato tribes were happy with the sale. But there was still discontent being stirred up by the missionaries. In my next podcast, I'll explain how it all unravelled. Be sure to check it out.